So we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm going to cover a few things in this talk. Specifically, want to talk about what tools you need in order to do Windows Phone development, where to get those tools, show you a few demos on how to use those tools, what kind of projects you can create. We'll talk a little bit about submitting apps to the marketplace, and then if you guys have any questions, feel free to post them, and I'll either answer them throughout if it's relevant to what I'm talking about at that moment. Otherwise, we'll just save them to the end and take as many as we can. So having said that, let's go ahead and start off. In order to get the tools, there's one place you need to go, and that's the App Hub website, which you can find at create.msdn.com. And I'd like to say a few things about the App Hub because it's actually a pretty cool site. There's a lot of stuff going on there. You've got a number of tabs up at the top of the site. You've got your dashboard, community, education, resources, and I'll come back to the dashboard later on in the talk because this is where you actually submit an app, but I did want to talk about the community tab. For example, you can find a lot of really good resources there in terms of community blogs, team blogs from Microsoft. The forums are there, so as you're working on projects and doing your development, if you run into questions or get stuck on something, the App Hub forums are a fantastic resource. I simply cannot stress that enough, that they're a great place to get in and ask questions, answer questions, search for stuff that's already been asked, which I highly recommend, and just in general, a really good resource that you would be denying yourself if you don't check it out. In addition to that, a few other things on that tab. There's the games catalog. So this is stuff that's been submitted through the App Hub or the Creators Club back before it was App Hub, and these are games that are on Xbox Live indie games, which is also a part of the App Hub, although today we're focusing on the Windows Phone relevant stuff. So in addition to the Community tab, you've got the Education tab. This is where you're going to find things like code samples, starter kits, various tutorials, labs. Some are specific to Windows Phone. A lot of them were created before Windows Phone, and there's still a lot of really good information in those, but they're not necessarily targeted for the phone. But there's actually quite a lot of content that's specific to Windows Phone, both for Silverlight and XNA, and we'll be talking a little bit about each of those today. And then in later webinars, next two, in fact, are deeper dives into Silverlight and XNA specifically, where we can really get into the meat of those projects. After the Education tab, you have the Resources tab. This is where you can find information about support, where you can go to download the SDK, find some partner offers. So there's a lot of companies out there that have partnered with Microsoft to make special offers to people who are doing phone development. There's a number of game development companies that have various engines and components that can make your life a little bit easier, as well as stuff for Silverlight. And so you can check those out from that page. So at this point, you're probably ready to get the tools and get started. So typically when you go to the site, you would click on the Download the Free Tools box, which is over on the left-hand side. And you're going to get a page that looks more or less like this, depending on when you go. And this is where you're actually going to download the SDK. Currently, there are two versions of the tool set you can download. The 7.0 set, which is the current stable release, is actually three different things to download. This is the Windows Phone SDK, the Developer Tools January update, and the Windows Phone Developer Tools Fix. If you're going to be working with the 7.0 tool set, you need to download and install all three of these items in that order. The update adds a few things, the fix fixes a few things, but you're going to want all three of them to install. If you're a little more adventurous, you can pull down the 7.1 beta instead. The 7.1 stuff's pretty cool. It's got nice, cool, refreshing bits of Mango in it, which for those of you that aren't familiar, Mango is the code name for the upcoming Windows Phone OS release. It's going to be a big one. Lots of performance improvements, some new features, new functionality. So definitely very cool. This webinar focuses on the 7.0 tools, but definitely check out the 7.1 tools if you're looking to do anything that's specific to the Mango update, or if you're interested in doing VB for XNA on the on the Windows Phone, then you need the 7.1 update for that as well. There is no VB support in 7.0. When you download the tools, as I mentioned, the first thing you're going to do is download the SDK. When you download that and install it, you're actually getting a lot of tools. You're getting Visual Studio 2010 Express for Windows Phone. You're getting the Windows Phone emulator. You're going to get XNA Game Studio. You're getting Expression Blend for Windows Phone, and you're getting some samples and documentation. Now, if you already have Visual Studio 2010 Pro or higher on your computer, then it's not going to install the Express Edition as well. It's just going to install an add-in that will allow you to use the new project types and the new functionality within your existing install of Visual Studio 2010. But if you don't have it, no worries. You'll get the Express Edition, and you'll get all the projects and everything that you need in order to do Windows Phone development. Now, at this point, I like to point out that up till now, everything's free. Okay, the tools are free, the updates are free, the emulator, all of that is free. There's no charge for using any of this. You can download it, run it on your machine, start developing right away, test your stuff in the emulator, and you haven't spent a dime other than on your development machine. Once you start getting ready to deploy your app to a device, either for testing or when you're ready to deploy to the marketplace, that's when you're going to run into some costs. And currently that cost is $99 a year. And what that gets you is the ability to submit an unlimited number of paid applications or games and up to 100 free submissions. Now what that means is if you charge anything at all for your app or game, then it's considered a paid app, and you can submit as many of those as you want. Microsoft handles the transaction in the marketplace. They take a standard 30%, which is the same as what Apple does on the iPhone. And then the other option, of course, is a free app. So they do limit the number of free app submissions, but if by some chance you actually exceed 100 of them, then there's a secondary fee. You can spend $20, I believe, that's correct, and get an additional 100 free submissions. So if you're looking to do this as a business, it's actually a pretty minor cost investment. Ultimately, you're really just paying, most of that money is going to the identity verification that's part of the initial sign-up process, so they can make sure you are who you say you are and get all the payment and everything set up. Now, in addition to paid apps and free apps, there is a third option, which we actually dig into in a later webinar, which are ad-supported apps. As far as Microsoft is concerned, these are still considered free apps because you're not charging for them, but there is a way for you to make money off of them, which of course is ad revenue. And so we'll talk about that later on. Assuming you've already downloaded the tool set and you're in Visual Studio and you're ready to get rolling, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to switch over to Visual Studio, and we're going to take a look at some of the starter projects that you get with the install. So here I've got Visual Studio 2010 open. We've got the new project dialog open, and you can see I'm actually not running the Express Edition here, so you'll see some other project types in the templates as well. But we've got Silverlight for Windows Phone, and we have XNA Game Studio 4.0. So if we start with Silverlight, we've got a Windows Phone application, a data-bound application, standard class library, panorama application, and a pivot application. So before I start a new project, I want to talk a little bit about some of the differences between Silverlight and XNA and when you would use either. So typically, you're going to want to use Silverlight if you're looking for a more traditional development experience. So you're looking for UI controls, event-driven programming. You like working in XAML, or maybe you want to do some cool panorama type apps where the the app scrolls side to side, and you've seen some of these apps. So if you have a Windows phone, you've certainly seen them already. On the other hand, you might want to use XNA if you're used to working in a game loop situation, or you're looking to do high performance graphics, you're looking to do some game development. You can do game development in Silverlight just like you can do app development in XNA, but the two are definitely geared to their specialties. And if you're wanting to do app development, you're probably going to pick Silverlight. And if you're wanting to do game development, it makes sense to do XNA. But again, you could do it either way. Totally up to you. We'll start off with Silverlight. So just create a basic Windows Phone application. So I'll go ahead and create that. And then we'll take a look at what you get as part of that. So give me just a moment to zoom this down where everybody can see it okay. So with a regular Silverlight phone application, you're going to get your XAML, which is pretty basic. You've got a little bit of definition here. You've got a stack panel, a couple of text blocks. So you've got your application, the page name. We can flip over and see there's not a whole lot in the code behind. A little bit of stuff going on. But anybody who has already been doing traditional .NET development, this should feel fairly comfortable. You've got your code behind, you've got your XAML. If you've been doing Silverlight, they haven't really changed how you're doing Silverlight for the most part. And so if we wanted to do a very simple hello world, we could go over here to our text block and change the text from page name to hello world, and then go ahead and save that. And before I run it, one thing you want to always make sure is up here in this drop-down, you've got a choice of Windows Phone device or Windows Phone emulator. I'm going to be sticking to the emulator. By default, it always says device, and about probably at least 2 or 3 times a day I forget and hit F5 and get a nice little error that tells me my phone's not hooked up. So you'll probably run into that at least once. So I'm going to flip over to the emulator, and we'll go ahead and run this so you can see it on the emulator. Just take a second. And so here we have our very simple Hello World application. Now the emulator is actually really cool. There's a lot of cool stuff going on here, and you can do a lot with it. It doesn't look like there's much going on at the moment, but there actually is. When you're developing, regardless of whether it's XNA or it's Silverlight, whether it's a simple traditional app like this, or maybe a panorama app, or maybe it's a 2D XNA game or a 3D really performance-heavy XNA game, they're all going to work on the emulator. Microsoft has done a fantastic job of building this to be as close to the phone as possible. Now there's some things you don't have, certainly. You're not going to have GPS in the emulator. You're not going to have the accelerometer sensor or the proximity sensor or stuff like that. So there are some limitations. The emulator itself is actually not throttled, which this is a huge deal. When you're developing your app, at some point before you submit, get your hands on an actual phone, whether it's yours or somebody else's. Get a hold of a phone and test your app on an actual physical device. The reason for this is because, as I said, the emulator is not throttled. So you may have a really beefy development machine with tons of power, and your app runs great in the emulator, only to find out that when you run it on a phone, maybe there's a few things you're not doing as efficiently as you could be, and it runs really slow on the phone. And so that was a pretty nasty surprise to a lot of people before the launch, when a lot of people didn't have access to phones, and there was a lot of development going on, and people were pushing stuff up to the marketplace in anticipation of launch day, and then a lot of apps were actually performing quite poorly. So something to keep in mind. A few other things about the emulator. You can tweak it a little bit. It does have the back button and start screen. We'll go ahead and minimize that. You can do things like simulate local storage with the emulator. You can call out to the internet. It has full support for the search button as well. When you are working with the emulator, you typically want to keep it running all the time. And as long as you're doing development. The reason for this is that anytime you close out the emulator and restart it, it's like getting a brand new phone and turning it on for the first time. So if you are working with an application that pushes information out to local storage, for example, and then you turn off the emulator and come back, it's gone. There is no persistence from one to the next. So if you just keep it running in the background, you could have 3 or 4 instances of Visual Studio open, no problem, and you can push stuff from any of them to the emulator, and it's just like having a regular phone. But once you shut it down and start it back up, it's been wiped. So just keep that in mind. So this is the basic Windows Phone app. As I said, you've got a little bit of XAML here, some sample code showing how to use the application bar. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because the basic phone app's a little boring. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and close this solution, and we'll go ahead and create a panorama app. Just take a second. So these are actually pretty cool. I like these a lot. I think they look really neat, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with them. So let me resize this a little bit so it looks good on the screen. Now the way these work, if you've seen them before, which those of you who have phones almost certainly have, now go ahead and fire it up and bring over the emulator. So the way these work is you can scroll up and down, and then you can also scroll side to side, and so you might have multiple items within a menu type scenario with sub-items under each of those, and so you can move back and forth, and you've got your title up at the top. It's got this nice panorama view. You've got your background graphic that wraps around. Very, very Windows Phone, very, very Metro, very popular. So we'll go ahead and close this and then take a look at what gives us this and do a little bit of modifying to it. So we'll go ahead and exit out of that. We'll flip back over here. So again, we've got our XAML, and this time we've got a couple of panorama items. So we've got our first item here, and then right below that you can see we have a second item that has a little bit more to it. It's creating a small image, just a single color image to display next to the line items. So if we wanted to create, for example, a third item, we could just grab this entire section, go ahead and copy that, and we'll go ahead and insert a copy of it Oh, it's still running. Oops, let me go ahead and stop it. My stop button has disappeared. Just one moment. It's really bizarre. Here we go. Couldn't find it. Sorry about that. We'll go ahead and stop that. And then paste in our third item. And we'll go ahead and rename that third item. And if we run it again, flip back over to the emulator, you can see we've got our first item, our second item, and then our third item. So just a very basic demo of how a panorama application works in Silverlight. Go ahead and close that and stop it. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Silverlight, of course, you know there's a tremendous amount more stuff you can do as far as adding in different types of functionality. You've got your stack panels, the text box, you've got full access to a toolbox, so all of your traditional UI controls. And I mention this again for a reason, because there is no concept of a UI in XNA, not as far as UI controls. There's no text box or drop down or anything like that in XNA. So if that's the type of experience you're looking for, then you definitely want to stick with Silverlight. So that's the two Silverlight projects I was going to show, the phone app and the Panorama app, and now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about XNA. So go ahead and close this solution and create. Scroll down here, create an XNA phone game. With the tools install, you actually get more than just support for phone games. You also get XNA support for Windows games and Xbox 360 games. So today we'll go ahead and create a Windows Phone game using XNA. Now, I mentioned before that XNA uses a slightly different programming model. Actually, slightly is probably an understatement. It uses a significantly different programming model. The good news is if you're familiar with CSharp, you've already got a leg up. So we're still using CSharp, we're still using .NET, but there's a few key differences. As I mentioned before, there's no real concept of UI controls, and as a result of that, you don't really use events except in a few edge cases. If you're calling WCF services, then you're going to be doing this asynchronously, and you need to set up a delegate to get fired when you get a response back. So that's an event. If you get information from the accelerometer, that's going to be an event. Typically, if you're interacting with something outside of your game, then you're going to need an event. But you're not dealing with stuff like click events or selected items from drop-downs or anything like that. So the way XNA typically works is you've got something called a game loop. And the game loop is the core of your game. Within the game loop, there's two methods. There's update and draw. Now, the way this works is typically the update method is going to be used to handle stuff like reading in player input. So whether they're touching the screen on the phone or they're pushing the back button to pull up a menu, that's all going to be player input. You would pull for that in the update method. This is also where you would do stuff like calculating trajectories, updating game objects. So if you've got a Mario type game where your little Hummer guy is running across the screen, you're updating his position in the update method. You're setting various properties about Mario in the update method, and then in the draw method you take that game state information and you use it to render the appropriate items on screen. So whether that's a barrel rolling down a hill or Mario's trajectory within a jump, all of that's going to get rendered on screen during the draw method. Prior to those two methods, there's a couple other key methods. You've got initialize and load content. Load content is typically where you're going to load up stuff like graphics resources, sound files. If you're wanting to display any text on screen, you're going to use something called a Sprite font, which I'll dig into in a little more detail in just a moment. And so you're going to load that up during load content. The initialize method is usually where you would do stuff like checking for any external services, doing any initialization of stuff before your game starts. Once you're in the game loop, though, each pass through that loop is a call to update and a call to draw. Now, those of you who play a lot of games have probably heard people talk about frame rate. And so, especially with 3D games and first-person shooters, frame rate's a really big deal. So when you hear somebody talk about 60 frames per second, that's 60 passes through that game loop per second. Now, that means 60 calls to update, 60 calls to draw per second. The Xbox is fixed at 60 frames per second. Windows Phone is fixed at 30 frames per second. Now, we'll go ahead and do a simple Hello World type application in XNA. In order to do that, we're going to use something called a Sprite font because, as I mentioned before, there are no actual controls for XNA. So if you want to render text on screen, you either need to draw it manually as a graphic or use a Sprite font, which takes an existing font that's on your system, converts it into a bitmap, and then draws the individual characters on screen based on whatever string you pass to it. So in order to do this, we'll go over to the Solution Explorer, and in the content project of your phone game project, you're going to add a Sprite font, and then we'll take a look at what exactly a Sprite font is. So we'll go ahead and add a Sprite font, and that's going to open it up. And the Sprite font file is actually just an XML file that you provide some basic information about the font you want to use. So in this case, we'll just leave it with the default font, and maybe we'll up the size a little bit, make it nice and readable. And there's a few other properties in here you can play with. You can set it from regular to bold if you want. And perhaps you've got a font other than one of the normal system fonts that you get by default on your system. Maybe you purchased a really cool font, but you only want to use a subset of it. So you can actually specify the start and end characters within that font. And so anything that's not within that range just won't get built into the Sprite font. So having set it up for size 20 bold using our default font, I'll go ahead and save this and switch back to the game. And we're going to create a Sprite font variable, and we'll just call it font. And then in the load content, we're going to go ahead and load up that Sprite font. And what's going to happen is when we build, oops, hang on, when we actually do our build, it's going to load up that Sprite font, and it's going to look at it, and it's going to convert it from the XML file. It's going to read in the font that exists on the system, and it's going to create a bitmap from the characters that are in that font. So what we're doing here is we're telling our content.load method what exactly we're looking to load in, because we're going to use the same content.load to load in graphics, to load in sound. So in this case, we're loading in a Sprite font, and we're going to specify the asset name, which you can find if you go back over here and you take a look at the properties for the Sprite font we just added. You can see that it's got an asset name of Sprite Font 1. And so we'll grab that, put that in right here. And by default, anything you add into the content project, XNA knows where to find. And so if you create subfolders under that, then you'll need to add the subfolders here with the asset name, but otherwise you're good to go. So we're going to load up the actual bitmap into a Sprite font, and then what will happen is when we're ready to draw some text on screen, we can pass it a string and the name of the font, and off we go. And there's a little more to it than that, which you'll see in just a moment. So in this case, we don't need to do anything special in the update method because we're not actually updating anything. We're just going to draw directly to the screen. So we can go down here to the draw method. Now before we can draw anything on screen, especially with a 2D game, we need to use something called a Sprite Batch. And the way a Sprite Batch works is if you have a bunch of things that you want to draw to the screen, trying to send a message to the graphics processor on your video card separately for each individual item you draw on screen is horribly inefficient. Maybe you're playing, or maybe you're creating a Space Invaders type of game where you have 60 different objects moving around on screen at the same time. You don't want to try to send 60 calls to the video card per frame 60 times per second. That would be ridiculous, and your game would run ridiculously slow. So what you do is you use a Sprite Batch. And a Sprite Batch lets you bundle all of your calls together into one. So we'll set up our Sprite Batch here, Sprite Batch.begin, Sprite Batch.end, and then within that, we're going to call the drawString method. And if you wanted to display an image, you would use the draw method. But for our purposes, we call drawString. We're going to pass in the name of our font, which we called font. Pass in the string, so hello world. We're going to give it a position. That uses a vector 2, which is basically an XY coordinate. There's also vector 3s, which would be X, Y, and Z. Those get used a lot more in 3D games. So we'll create a new vector 2, and we'll just display it at 50, 50. And last of all, we have a color. So since we have our cornflower blue background, we'll use black to display the text. So this is the color of the text. Now at this point, if we go ahead and hit F5, oh, and I'm going to get an error because I forgot to update the device I was pointing to. So go ahead and close that and switch it back to emulator. Told you it was going to happen at least once today. Go ahead and close that and hit F5 again. Flip over to the emulator. And here you can see we have Hello World showing on the screen. Now, if you wanted to show some graphics on the screen, as I mentioned, you would still use your load content to grab an image, load it up. You would need to add it to your solution first. Load up the image. Then you're going to use your Sprite Batch, use draw, and one specific thing about the draw call is that you still pass in a color. And the way this works is that color is effectively a tint to the image that you are drawing. So perhaps you're creating a race car game where you're using the accelerometer and the tilt sensor and maybe some touch to create a small racetrack game on your phone. Using it this way, you could actually just have one image of a car, and then you could use the color parameter to draw one of them red and draw another one blue and draw another one yellow without having to have 3 separate images loaded into memory. You would just draw the same image 3 different ways. So that's a lot more efficient and a lot easier on your artist because they can just provide you with one image and then you can manipulate it this way much easier. So we'll go ahead and exit out of this. Now, this is a very basic XNA app. As I said, it just shows Hello World. A couple of other things to look at while we're in here. The update method, by default, has some code in here that covers checking to see if the back button was pressed. And you may notice that the code actually makes reference to a gamepad, which obviously you can't plug a gamepad into your phone. This was originally created for the Xbox 360, but part of Microsoft's goal, especially with XNA, is to keep as much of your code base a shared code base as possible. So if you're writing a game that you want to port from the Xbox to Windows and also Windows Phone, other than changing the way you interact with the player, you could have a mostly shared code base between the 3 different versions. And so they accomplish that by doing stuff like this. Instead of giving you a completely different way to check for the back button on the phone or check for the back button if you have a controller plugged into your Windows machine, or checking for the back button on the 360, you do it the same way across the board. In addition to this, you've got some other things that work very similarly. So you have the audio API, which we're not really going to dig into today, but we will cover in a later webinar, which allows you to do stuff like recording and manipulation. And so you've got kind of this consistent experience whether you're using the phone or Windows. Even with the 360, there's just so much that you can do where you can have one set of graphics, and the phone itself actually has a hardware scaler built in, so you don't have to have 3 completely different sets of graphics depending on which platform your game is running on, because the phone can handle those graphics and then just scale the display accordingly. So they really have spent a lot of effort and time making sure you have a consistent experience, not only as a developer, but your gamers and your players will as well. So I'll go ahead and exit out of this and go back to our, close that. assuming you have built an app either with Silverlight or XNA, at some point you're going to want to submit it to the marketplace. So the App Hub, as I mentioned before, has a dashboard, and within that dashboard is where you're going to see any apps that you've already published, along with giving you the ability to submit new ones. So when you're submitting an app, you're going to have to provide a fair amount of information with regards to what does your app do, what artwork do you want to display in the Zune marketplace, how much do you want to charge for your app, stuff like that. So the first step, of course, is to submit it. Now, you can't submit an app unless you actually have the marketplace, and so, or excuse me, the marketplace subscription, which is the $99 a year that we talked about earlier. So once you have that, and you log in, you click on the Submit Your App link. It's going to take you to this screen where you will take the compiled ZAP, and regardless of whether you're doing Silverlight or XNA, you're going to end up with a ZAP file in the bin folder of your solution, and you're going to add that where it says Application Package. You're going to click on that and add your ZAP file, and give your app a name. And assuming the default language might be something other than English, then you're going to want to select that, and then you're going to click Next, and it's going to walk you through this wizard where you're going to provide them some information regarding what your app does, give a small description to be displayed in the marketplace. They're going to do some reflection on your app and figure out what phone functionality it uses. So for example, if you're connecting to any external WCF services, or if you're using the GPS, or if you're using any kind of personally identifiable information, anything like that, they're going to detect and test specifically for. So some potential fail conditions when submitting your app could be that you call a WCF service, but if your phone is in an area where it cannot get a signal at all, instead of failing gracefully, it blows up. So they will check for that and potentially reject it if that happens. There's actually a really good document which you can find on the App Hub that breaks down in significant detail everything that you need to check for before submitting. And it's stuff like how they expect the back button to behave, and making sure that you're catching any exceptions that are being generated, making sure that if you are using the GPS that you let your user know ahead of time. If they're running a custom playlist of music on the phone and you start up a game that has its own background music, then you give them the option to listen to their music instead of yours. There's a lot of little gotchas, but they're broken out in the certification document, and if you read through that prior to submitting your application, then you shouldn't have any problem. So once you've uploaded your app and they've scanned it and determined, okay, it uses these things, then you provide your description information, basically this is how you're going to sell the app, or whether it's free or not, you want to sell it in the concept that you want people to download it. So this is what really sells the app. And then on step 3, you're going to upload artwork. And so this is artwork that shows screenshots. This is the icon that's going to show up on the start page of your phone if you pin it to start. This is the artwork that's going to show up in the marketplace as the background. And any other artwork that you want to add, you're allowed to add up to, I believe, 7 screenshots of your app actually running, or your game. After that, you're going to set pricing, whether it's free or you're charging for it, and you can charge anywhere from 99 cents up to, I believe, $1,000. And they're not using Microsoft points. So one thing you'll notice, if you've done any development for the Xbox Live Indie games, all of those are purchased using Microsoft points. On the phone, they are not forcing you to use Microsoft points, and they're not locking you into specific price points like they do on Xbox Live Indie games. You can set your price pretty much anywhere you want. Once you've got all of your screenshots and your images and your description and everything set, you can go ahead and submit. This is when they actually put your app through its paces. So this is where they check to make sure all the functionality that they identified in your app is actually working, make sure that it's behaving as expected. Usually takes about 3 days. That's been my experience. It can take longer. If they've got a lot of apps coming in, it can certainly take longer. But typically it takes about 3 days. And then you'll get an email back with a very detailed report, and I've gotten a few of them, that explain exactly why your app failed. Or if it passed, then you'll get an email back saying that congratulations, your app has passed marketplace certification, and if you chose to push it to the marketplace automatically after certification, then it can take about a day to show up in the marketplace. Otherwise, you can actually set the date of when you would like it to go live. This gives you the opportunity to maybe do some marketing and promotion for your app or game before it actually hits the servers, and so that way you have some time to build up some excitement maybe, or run some ads or whatever it is you want to do. And then, of course, once it's in the marketplace, it's just a matter of people download it. If they like it, they can come back and rate it, write reviews about it. If you want to add additional functionality, there is the capability to update your app once it's out there. And that's pretty much it for this webinar. If anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer any questions about the publishing process or the tools. Looks like we have one here. Are there any code analysis rules that can be added to check for any of the Windows Phone 7 certification requirements? I don't think there's anything built in as far as in Visual Studio. I know that there are certainly tools that you could work with to do that sort of thing, but by default I would say that there's not anything built in currently. Looks like we've got another question here about the update process. Is it the same process we do for the app submission, or is there any special method since it's an update? Typically, if you're doing an update to your app, you're still going to submit it through the same process, and it still is going to get verified by the team at Microsoft, so they're still going to check it out and make sure everything works as expected. I will say there have been cases where people have submitted an app that may have had a bug in it that for some reason did not get picked up the first time around, and once they submitted their update, the bug showed up and the app got rejected. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. But as far as the process, it's the same. Okay, next question. When will there be further webinars in this series, and will they continue to be free? There are more webinars. So there's 6 more in this series. We're doing 1 each week. The next one is a deeper dive into XNA, and then after that is a deeper dive into Silverlight, and then we've got a couple more about some specific game development related functionality with XNA. There's a webinar on using the advertising SDK, and yeah, free. DevExpress is hosting all the webinars, and they will continue to be free, and if you aren't able to catch them when they're aired, you can always come back later and watch them or re-watch them or get your friends to watch them or whatever, by all means. What's next? How can I test WCF web services on my local host when testing on a real device? My endpoint address is obviously wrong. So when you're making WCF calls, that's probably a little bit out of the scope of this one, although I can certainly address that when we do the deeper dive in a later webinar. But you can definitely test them whether you're in the emulator or on a real device. That is, I've done it, but it's a longer conversation than we can have right this moment. So what from standard Silverlight development transfers to XNA development, other than C# language and XAML, of course? So there's actually not any XAML in XNA, although in the 7.1 bits, when you get the nice little chunks of Mango, you will be able to, down the road, be able to have a Silverlight project that has XNA in it. That's one of the things that we've been looking forward to being able to do, although that's not in 7.0. But So as far as what transfers to XNA, I would say that they're actually pretty different aside from C# and, well, aside from C#. The programming approach is different. None of the controls move over. If you want to display stuff on screen, you're pretty much using images. And of course, there's the 3D stuff, which I didn't even really touch on today. Next question. How about apps which have operator tie-ups? Can they be installed directly on phone instead of Marketplace? So currently, there is no announced plan or method for doing any kind of side loading or anything like that. Now, obviously, the phone carriers have a special relationship with Microsoft, and they can stick stuff on there that you're not having to pull down from the Marketplace. But as far as developers like us, I guess, which are people who don't necessarily have a special relationship with Microsoft, no, if you want to push an app out to the phone, it needs to go through the Marketplace, at least at this time. Next question. What is the difference between pivot control and panorama page in the example usages? I can dig into the pivot control in a little more detail in the next in the third webinar, which is when I do the Silverlight deep dive. Ultimately, the panorama page, which is the one I showed, allows you to do stuff like apps that replicate the hubs. So if you've seen a Windows Phone or if you have a Windows Phone, there's this really cool concept that they don't have on the other phones called hubs, which tends to be kind of everything that's similar gets grouped into a hub, and you've got the whole panorama feel of scrolling left to right and up and down. And so you've got, for example, the video hub, the music hub, the games hub, and you're going to have stuff in there. Maybe you've got RSS feeds pulling in one item, and you've got a list of games that are waiting for you to take your turn and that sort of thing. Next question. About testing WCF, can I contact you via email? Certainly. My email is on the first slide and on the last slide, which I'll go ahead and flip over to that. My email is chrisgwilliams@gmail.com. It's on the slide there. So feel free. If you have any questions, definitely shoot me an email. If you're a new developer, should you stick with Mango? I would say that there's certainly no harm in starting with the 7.0 bits and upgrading to Mango. Some people don't like to work with beta SDKs. Some people don't have a problem with it. Some companies have policies against it, that sort of thing. But in general, you can use either. If you're looking to do Mango-specific stuff, then obviously you need to use the 7.1 bits. But if you're just looking to get started in general and you want to maybe do some cross-platform stuff with the Xbox, especially if you're looking to do games, then you're going to want to stick with 7.0. But otherwise, it's really at your choice. Next question. Can you create apps for yourself, install it on your phone without submitting it to the Marketplace? Absolutely. Now, you still need a membership. Okay, you still need the $99 because what that gives you is once you have the membership, you're going to have your device and you're going to register that as a developer device, which gives you the ability to push stuff out to your device. Now, you won't be able to push stuff out to anybody else's device unless it is also registered to receive files as a developer device. But yeah, you still need the membership, unfortunately. That's the only way you're going to be able to run stuff on the phone. But you don't have to push it out to the Marketplace. If you just want to create some apps for yourself and stick them on your phone, you don't have to share. Certainly, but you do need the membership. Okay, I think that was, we got another question. How about the multimedia capability of 7.0? Does it support HTTP streaming, RTSP streaming, and are APIs exposed to third-party developers? I'm going to say I don't actually know. That's not something I've really dug into. I'm not familiar with RTSP streaming. And I know that there are some people that are doing some streaming video and streaming audio, but I haven't really had much experience in that area. If you want to drop me an email, I can ask around and get an answer for you, and I'd be happy to reply back to that or post it in my blog so that everybody can benefit from it. but I currently don't know the answer to that. Any more questions? Looks like that was the last one.
Yeah, I think we got to all of them.
Great.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of oh, well, let's see, one did pop up.
Oh. Is there,
yeah.
I'm sorry, is there special recommendation phone device for developers starting now? Actually, any of the Windows phone devices will work just fine. It depends on your carrier, right? So I use AT&T. That's not necessarily a recommendation. And I have a Samsung Focus, which I love. But there are some really good phones on the other providers as well, whether you're using Sprint or T-Mobile. It's really just whatever features you like, whatever preferences you have, and of course whatever carrier you're currently locked into. That's going to define your choices, but they all have a good developer experience.
Awesome. So I think that was the last question. We'll see. I'm sure one or two more will pop up.
We are not currently doing a Mango version of the book, although I have suggested it to them, and if they decide they want to pursue that, then I'll be happy to jump on that. I guess I should have explained. Somebody asked me if we were doing a Mango version of the book. I guess y'all get it. Everybody can see the question. I'm not just promoting my book willy-nilly.
I know. You're not just promoting without. Awesome. Okay. So thank you, Chris. Like Chris said, he is doing an entire series with us on Windows Phone 7. Next two coming up in this series, which I think he already mentioned, they get more depth into today's topics. Next week, June 16th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, is a deeper dive into XNA on Windows Phone. And then June 23rd is a deep dive into Silverlight on Windows Phone. And then after that, there'll be 3 left throughout the month of June. So check out devexpress.com/webinars and register for those today. We also have a whole lineup of other webinars posted for the months of June and July. You can check them out and register at devexpress.com/webinars. So also coming up next week, along with Chris's next Windows Phone webinar, Monday, June 13th, an 11.1 reporting preview, new ASP.NET features with reporting evangelist Seth Juarez. This webinar will explore several new reporting features added to ASP.NET and our version 2011 Volume 1 release. The additions include native document map and parameter support in web forms, as well as new extensions available for MVC. So that's what's coming up next week as far as webinars. And again, if you missed anything from this webinar, you want to review previous webinars or check out hundreds of online product tutorials, you can visit us on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com. And Chris, I also think we just posted an interview we did with you at TechEd.
Yes.
On the DevExpress channel. So if you want to check that out and see what Chris looks like, you can find that at tv.devexpress.com as well. Let's see, one more question popped up. Let's see, do you have ASP.NET MVC 3 webinars, deeper dives? Yeah, we absolutely do. Check out the devexpress.com/webinars and check out the topics coming up. We also take suggestions for things that you all want to see. So if you want to see ASP.NET MVC, let us know. All right. So again, thanks to Chris. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for choosing DevExpress.
Thank you.